In a world where warfare has become a deadly game of technology and strategy, where satellites can spot a person from space and thermal imaging can detect body heat through walls, how does someone remain completely invisible while eliminating 12 highly trained soldiers in less than 8 minutes? The answer lies not in advanced equipment or supernatural abilities, but in the extraordinary story of a woman who turned her greatest perceived weakness into her most lethal advantage. They called her the Ghost of Sarajevo, though none of the enemy forces who hunted her ever learned her real name. For 3 years, she moved through war-torn streets like a shadow, striking with deadly precision before vanishing without a trace. Military commanders on both sides knew of her existence only through the aftermath she left behind. Perfectly placed shots that defied explanation, taken from impossible angles that left forensic experts scratching their heads. But on one particular morning in 1994, as dawn broke over the besieged city, she would accomplish something that would become legend among military snipers worldwide. In those 8 minutes that changed everything, she would prove that the most dangerous weapon in any conflict isn't the biggest gun or the smartest bomb. It's a human spirit when pushed beyond all limits. This is the true story of how a 32-year-old literature professor became one of the most feared marksmen in modern warfare, and how she used the very prejudices of her enemies against them in ways no military academy ever taught. It's a story of survival, precision, and the deadly cost of underestimating someone simply because of who they appear to be. The morning mist clung to the broken streets of Sarajevo like a burial shroud, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and the distant echo of sporadic gunfire. Amara Kovac pressed herself against the cold concrete wall of what had once been a children's library, her breathing controlled and silent despite the chaos erupting around her. Through the scope of her modified hunting rifle, she could see the enemy patrol moving with confident arrogance through the intersection below. They had no idea they were being watched. 6 months earlier, Amara had been grading papers in her literature classroom at the University of Sarajevo, debating the symbolism in Hemingway's war stories with students who thought conflict was something that happened in books. The irony wasn't lost on her now as she lived through horrors that would make even Hemingway's darkest tales seem tame. The transformation from professor to sniper hadn't happened overnight, but rather through a series of devastating losses that stripped away everything she once believed about civilization and human nature. The siege had begun like a distant thunderstorm, something people talked about in worried whispers while going about their daily lives. Amara remembered standing at her apartment window, watching smoke rise from the hills surrounding the city, never imagining that within weeks those same hills would be lined with enemy positions, turning her beloved Sarajevo into a shooting gallery where civilians became targets and children learned to run in zigzag patterns to avoid sniper fire. Her husband Marco had been among the first to answer the call to defend their city. A gentle man who taught mathematics and spent his weekends tending to their small garden. He had kissed her goodbye one Tuesday morning and promised to be home for dinner. That dinner grew cold on the table while Amara waited, and she would wait for 3 more days before a fellow teacher brought news that would shatter her world. Marco's unit had been ambushed while attempting to secure a supply route. There were no survivors. The grief hit her like a physical blow, doubling her over in her empty apartment while artillery shells whistled overhead. But grief in a war zone is a luxury no one can afford for long. Within a week of Marco's death, Amara's building was shelled, killing her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Petrov, and forcing the remaining residents into the basement. Food became scarce, water even more so, and the simple act of crossing the street became a potentially fatal gamble. It was during one of these dangerous supply runs that Amara first killed another human being. She had been returning from a market with a small bag of potatoes, precious cargo that had cost her wedding ring, and a photograph of her parents when she heard the scream. Around the corner, 2 enemy soldiers had cornered a teenage girl, their intentions clear from their leering faces and the way they held her against the wall. Amara's hands shook as she picked up a piece of concrete rubble, but her resolve didn't waver. The mathematics teacher's wife, who had never hurt a fly, struck the first soldier in the temple with precision that surprised even her. As he crumpled, his companion turned in shock, giving Amara the opening she needed to grab the fallen man's weapon. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in her hands, but the trigger pull was surprisingly light. The gunshot echoed off the broken buildings like thunder. Standing over the bodies, still holding the smoking rifle, Amara realized two things that would define the rest of her war. First, she felt no remorse for what she had done, only a cold satisfaction that justice had been served. Second, she had discovered she possessed an almost supernatural steadiness under pressure. Her hands hadn't shaken when she pulled the trigger, her breathing had remained controlled, and her aim had been perfect despite never having fired a weapon before in her life. The rescued girl, barely 16 and traumatized beyond words, would later tell others about the quiet woman who had appeared like an angel of vengeance. Word spread through the underground networks that sustained civilian resistance in the besieged city. Soon, other survivors sought out Amara, not just for protection, but for the skill she was rapidly developing. Dragan Milic, a former Yugoslav army sergeant who had deserted rather than fire on his own people, became her unlikely mentor. A bear of a man with gentle eyes and hands steady enough to thread a needle in the dark, he recognized something in Amara that even she didn't fully understand yet. During the long, dangerous nights when movement was possible, he taught her everything he knew about weapons, tactics, and the deadly art of remaining invisible in plain sight. The abandoned university became their classroom, its empty halls echoing with whispered lessons about wind speed calculations, bullet trajectory, and the psychology of warfare. Dragan had salvaged a collection of rifles from various sources, some taken from fallen soldiers, others provided by sympathetic arms dealers who supported the resistance. Each weapon had its own personality, its own quirks that had to be learned and mastered. But it was with distance shooting that Amara truly excelled. Something about the mathematical precision required, the way variables like wind, humidity, and target movement had to be calculated and compensated for, appealed to her academic mind. She approached sniping like a complex equation to be solved, breaking down each shot into its component parts and analyzing every factor that could affect the outcome. More importantly, she understood something that many trained military snipers never grasped: the power of being underestimated. Enemy forces expected resistance from men, from soldiers, from obvious threats. They didn't expect death to come from a woman in civilian clothes who could blend into a crowd of refugees or pose as a frightened civilian seeking shelter. Her gender, which military strategists might have seen as a liability, became her greatest asset. The first enemy soldier she killed from distance was a sniper who had been terrorizing her neighborhood from a church bell tower. For 3 days, he had made it impossible for anyone to cross the main street, picking off civilians who dared to venture out for water or food. Children had been forced to crawl on their bellies just to reach the communal well. Amara spent 2 nights studying his patterns, noting when he took breaks, when he changed positions, and, most importantly, when he became complacent. On the 3rd morning, as he settled into his routine, she was waiting 3 blocks away on the roof of a bombed-out department store. The shot was over 400 meters through swirling wind, requiring calculations that would challenge an experienced marksman. But Amara's mind worked through the variables with academic precision, and when she squeezed the trigger, the enemy sniper's reign of terror ended instantly. The psychological impact of that single shot rippled through both sides of the conflict. Civilians who had been trapped in their homes for days emerged to find their tormentor slumped motionless in his tower. More importantly, enemy forces realized they had a new problem. Someone was hunting the hunters, and they had no idea who or where this threat might be. As autumn turned to winter, Amara's reputation grew along with her skills. She developed a network of spotters and informants among the civilian population, ordinary people who risked their lives to provide intelligence about enemy positions and movements. Mrs. Yovanovitch, who ran a small bakery from her basement, became an invaluable source of information about which soldiers frequented which areas. Teenage boys like Petter, who could move through the ruins like ghosts, carried messages and supplies to Amara's various hiding spots throughout the city. The weapons in her arsenal grew more sophisticated as well. A sympathetic UN peacekeeper, horrified by the atrocities he witnessed daily, provided her with a military-grade rifle and high-quality optics. Black market dealers, many of them profiting from the city's misery, found it profitable to stay on the good side of the mysterious sniper who was eliminating some of their more troublesome competitors. But, perhaps most importantly, Amara learned to think like her enemies. She studied their tactics, their weaknesses, their psychology. She realized that many of them were conscripts, young men far from home who wanted nothing more than to survive their deployment and return to their families. These soldiers could sometimes be avoided, their patrols predicted, and their routines exploited without necessarily ending their lives. Others, however, were true believers in the ethnic cleansing that was tearing their country apart, or worse, sadists who enjoyed the power that war gave them over helpless civilians. These men she eliminated without hesitation or mercy. By spring, intelligence reports from enemy forces spoke of a ghost that haunted Sarajevo's ruins. Soldiers began traveling in larger groups, took more circuitous routes, and jumped at shadows. Some units refused to patrol certain sectors entirely, claiming the areas were cursed. The psychological warfare was working, but Amara knew that her greatest challenge still lay ahead. The enemy's response to her growing effectiveness was predictable and brutal. They increased their targeting of civilians, hoping to flush out the sniper by making the cost of her actions unbearable to the population. They brought in their own counter-sniper specialists, trained killers whose only job was to hunt her down. Most dangerously, they began using the civilian population as human shields, making it nearly impossible for Amara to take clear shots without risking innocent lives. It was during this escalation that Amara received intelligence about a planned operation that would change everything. Through her network of informants, she learned that a special enemy unit was planning to execute a group of captured civilians in the city's main square as a public demonstration of power. The execution was scheduled for dawn, and the enemy was counting on the fact that no one would dare interfere with such a heavily guarded operation. They were wrong about that, just as they had been wrong about so many other things. As Amara cleaned her rifle and checked her equipment in the abandoned apartment that served as her base of operations, she wasn't planning just to disrupt their propaganda demonstration. She was planning to turn it into their nightmare. The mathematics of the operation were complex beyond anything she had attempted before. 12 targets spread across an open area, all of them trained soldiers expecting trouble, with multiple escape routes and overlapping fields of fire. The window of opportunity would be brief, measured in minutes rather than hours, and there would be no second chances. If she failed, the captured civilians would die, and her own death would likely follow shortly after. But as Amara laid down to catch a few hours of sleep before the most important morning of her life, she felt the same calm that had settled over her the day she first picked up a rifle. Mathematics didn't lie, physics was predictable, and human nature was surprisingly consistent. She had spent months learning her enemy's weaknesses, and tomorrow she would exploit every single one of them. The last thought that crossed her mind before sleep took her was a memory of Marco, sitting at their kitchen table grading papers while she prepared dinner. He had looked up at her with those gentle eyes and said something that seemed prophetic now. "You know, my love, I think you could do anything you set your mind to. You have a way of seeing solutions that other people miss entirely." Tomorrow, the entire world would discover just how right he had been. The clock on the abandoned bank building showed 5:47 a.m. when Amara reached her chosen position. She had arrived 2 hours early, moving through the pre-dawn darkness like smoke, using routes she had memorized over months of careful reconnaissance. The building she selected was perfect for her purposes, a 4-story office complex that had been gutted by artillery fire, leaving empty window frames that provided multiple shooting angles while offering quick escape routes through the destroyed interior. Her equipment was laid out with surgical precision on the concrete floor beside her. The modified rifle that had become her signature weapon gleamed dully in the pale light filtering through the broken windows. Beside it lay her rangefinder, wind meter, and the notebook where she had calculated every possible angle and distance for the morning's work. Most importantly, she had prepared multiple ammunition clips, each bullet carefully inspected and counted. 12 targets would require 12 shots, and she had brought enough ammunition for 3 times that number, knowing that in combat, redundancy could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Through her high-powered scope, Amara could see the main square beginning to take shape in the growing light. The enemy had been busy during the night, setting up their execution theater with theatrical precision. A wooden platform had been erected in the center of the square, clearly visible from all surrounding buildings. They wanted as many witnesses as possible to their display of power. Sandbag positions had been established at strategic points around the perimeter, each manned by soldiers whose body language spoke of confidence and routine. What they didn't know was that for the past 3 days, Amara had been studying every aspect of their preparations. Hidden among groups of frightened civilians, disguised as a refugee seeking food handouts, she had observed their guard rotations, timed their patrols, and, most crucially, identified the command structure that kept their operation organized. Military units, even irregular ones, followed predictable patterns, and Amara had learned to read those patterns like a scholar reading ancient texts. At exactly 6:15 a.m., the execution squad began moving into position. Amara counted 12 soldiers in total, just as her intelligence had indicated. 4 positioned on the platform itself, 1 officer who would presumably oversee the executions, and 3 enlisted men who would carry out the actual killings. 8 more soldiers formed a defensive perimeter around the square, positioned at roughly 40-meter intervals to provide overlapping fields of fire and prevent any rescue attempts. The condemned civilians were brought out at 6:22 a.m., a sight that made Amara's carefully controlled breathing hitch for just a moment before training reasserted itself. 6 people, ranging in age from a teenage boy to an elderly woman, their hands bound behind their backs and cloth bags over their heads. She recognized 2 of them even through their rough treatment. The boy was Nicola, who had been caught carrying messages for the resistance, and the elderly woman was Mrs. Hadzik, whose only crime had been teaching children in her basement when schools were no longer safe. The mathematics of her task crystallized in Amara's mind with perfect clarity. 12 targets spread across approximately 120 meters of open space, with the farthest enemy position being 340 meters from her location. Wind was light, but shifting, requiring constant adjustment. Most challenging of all, she would need to eliminate the threats in a specific sequence to prevent any of them from killing the hostages in their final moments. Her first target was obvious, the officer on the platform who was clearly in command of the operation. Take out the head, and the body would thrash around blindly for crucial seconds while subordinates try to understand what was happening. But timing would be everything. Too early, and the remaining soldiers would have time to execute the hostages out of spite. Too late, and innocent blood would stain the platform before she could prevent it. Through her scope, Amara watched the enemy commander check his watch and begin what appeared to be a brief speech to his men. This was standard operating procedure for such operations, a final pep talk to ensure everyone understood their roles and felt appropriately motivated to carry out what was essentially murder dressed up as military justice. The speech would last approximately 3 minutes based on similar operations she had observed, giving her a perfect window to make her final preparations. She adjusted her scope for the precise distance to the platform, 287 meters according to her rangefinder. Wind was currently coming from the northwest at approximately 8 kilometers per hour, requiring a minimal adjustment to the left. Temperature was cool, but rising as the sun climbed higher, which would affect bullet trajectory over longer distances. Each variable was calculated and compensated for with a precision that had made her one of the most feared marksmen in the conflict. At 6:29 a.m., the enemy commander stepped forward and raised his hand, clearly preparing to give the signal for the executions to begin. This was the moment Amara had been waiting for, the split second when all variables aligned and hesitation meant death for 6 innocent people. Her first shot took the commander in the head from nearly 300 meters away, dropping him instantly and sending his subordinates into immediate confusion. Before his body had even hit the platform, Amara was already shifting her aim to the soldier standing closest to the hostages. Her second shot, fired 3 seconds after the first, eliminated him before he could process what was happening to his commander. The remaining soldiers on the platform began to react now, but their training worked against them. Instead of immediately killing the hostages and taking cover, they looked around wildly for the source of the gunfire, giving Amara precious additional seconds to continue her deadly work. Her third shot dropped the soldier who was raising his rifle toward the captives, while her fourth eliminated the last man on the platform before he could take cover behind the sandbag barriers. 4 shots, 4 kills, elapsed time, 18 seconds. The platform was clear of threats, but Amara's work was far from over. The 8 perimeter guards were now fully alert and beginning to respond with professional efficiency. They couldn't see her muzzle flash from her concealed position, but they were smart enough to begin laying down suppressing fire on the most likely sniper positions while moving to better cover themselves. This was where Amara's months of preparation and her understanding of military psychology became crucial. She had anticipated exactly this response and positioned herself not in the most obvious sniper nest, but in a location that would allow her to take the perimeter guards from an unexpected angle while they focused their attention on more conventional threats. Her 5th shot targeted the soldier who was attempting to coordinate the defensive response, a sergeant whose hand signals and positioning marked him as the senior non-commissioned officer present. Military units could function without officers if they had experienced NCOs, but remove both leadership levels simultaneously, and even well-trained soldiers became little more than armed individuals acting on instinct rather than strategy. The 6th and 7th shots came in rapid succession, targeting soldiers who were attempting to establish communication with their headquarters, cut off their ability to call for reinforcements or air support, and even a large force could be reduced to fighting blind. Amara had learned this lesson from Dragan, who had emphasized that modern warfare was as much about information and communication as it was about firepower. By now, the remaining 5 soldiers had figured out approximately where the shots were coming from and were beginning to return fire. Bullets whined past Amara's position, some coming uncomfortably close, but her chosen location provided excellent protection while still allowing her to maintain clear sight lines to her targets. She had spent hours in this exact spot, practicing her movements and memorizing every angle and distance until she could operate effectively even under intense pressure. Her 8th shot was perhaps the most difficult of the engagement, targeting a soldier who had taken cover behind an overturned car and was providing accurate suppressing fire that threatened to pin her down. The shot required threading the needle through a gap barely larger than a man's head, compensating for both wind and the fact that her target was partially concealed. When the rifle cracked, the soldiers' return fire stopped immediately. For soldiers remained, and they were beginning to panic. Their training told them to maintain their positions and continue the fight, but their survival instincts were screaming at them to flee from an enemy they couldn't see or effectively engage. This internal conflict made them predictable, and predictable enemies were dead enemies in Amara's experience. The 9th shot dropped a soldier who had broken from cover in an attempt to reach a better position. Running in a straight line across open ground was suicide against a skilled marksman, but fear makes even trained fighters do foolish things. The 10th shot eliminated another soldier who had made the mistake of exposing himself while trying to get a better angle on Amara's position. 2 soldiers left, both of them now completely demoralized and uncertain. Through her scope, Amara could see one of them looking back and forth between her general direction and the avenue that would lead to safety. The other had pressed himself so tightly against his cover that he was effectively out of the fight, too terrified to expose any part of his body to return fire. Amara took careful aim at the soldier who was still attempting to maintain the engagement. Her 11th shot was fired at 6:37 a.m., exactly 8 minutes after she had begun her deadly work. The soldier crumpled behind his barricade, leaving only one enemy combatant alive in the square. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Amara held the final soldier in her crosshairs. He was young, probably no older than 20, and she could see terror written in every line of his body. This was likely his first real combat experience, and he had just watched 11 of his comrades die in rapid succession at the hands of an enemy he couldn't even see. The smart tactical decision would be to eliminate him as well, ensuring that no one remained to report on what had happened or potentially threaten the hostages. But as Amara studied the boy through her scope, she remembered something Dragan had told her. The enemy you spare today might become the ally you need tomorrow. Fear teaches lessons that bullets cannot. Instead of firing, Amara shifted her aim slightly and put her 12th and final shot into the ground 3 feet from where the young soldier lay hidden. The message was unmistakable. She had him dead to rights, but was choosing to let him live. What he did with that gift was up to him. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The young soldier abandoned his weapon and ran from the square as fast as his legs could carry him, disappearing into the maze of ruined buildings that surrounded the area. Within minutes, the civilians who had been scheduled for execution were being freed by resistance members who had been waiting for Amara's signal to move in. But Amara herself was already gone, having slipped away from her sniper's nest the moment she fired her final shot. By the time enemy reinforcements arrived at the scene, they found only empty shell casings and the impossible evidence of what one person with exceptional skill and careful preparation could accomplish in 8 minutes of perfectly executed violence. The psychological impact of that morning's work would ripple through the enemy forces for the remainder of the siege. Soldiers who had previously moved with confidence through Sarajevo's streets now jumped at shadows, convinced that death could come from any window or rooftop. Officers found it increasingly difficult to find volunteers for high-risk operations, and morale plummeted as word spread about the mysterious sniper who could eliminate an entire squad in less time than it took to drink a cup of coffee. More importantly, the civilian population saw proof that they were not helpless, that someone was fighting back against those who would terrorize and murder innocent people. In a city where hope had become a scarce commodity, Amara's 8 minutes of precision shooting had delivered something more valuable than food or medicine. Proof that the monsters could be beaten, that justice was still possible even in the darkest of times. As she made her way back to her safe house through the labyrinthine ruins of her beloved city, Amara carried with her the knowledge that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. She was no longer a literature professor who had taken up arms in self-defense. She was something new, something that the war had forged from tragedy and necessity, a weapon of precision wrapped in human flesh, capable of bringing death to her enemies with surgical accuracy and unwavering resolve. The 12 shots fired that morning had taken less than 8 minutes to execute, but their consequences would echo through the remainder of the conflict and beyond. In saving 6 innocent lives, Amara had also saved something equally precious: the idea that in a world gone mad with violence and hatred, one person with courage and skill could still make a difference between justice and atrocity. The manhunt began within hours of the square incident, and Amara knew that her life had fundamentally changed in those 8 minutes of deadly precision. No longer could she move through the city with relative anonymity. Every enemy patrol now carried her description, compiled from the testimony of the young soldier she had spared and the increasingly desperate intelligence efforts of forces determined to eliminate the ghosts that haunted their operations. Safe houses that had sheltered her for months became death traps overnight. Informants who had fed her intelligence found themselves under surveillance or simply disappeared in the night. The network that had sustained her operations began to fracture under pressure as the enemy escalated their efforts to root out anyone connected to the mysterious sniper who had humiliated their forces so publicly. Dragan found her 3 days after the square, appearing like a shadow in the abandoned subway tunnel where she had taken refuge. The big man's face was grim as he settled beside her in the darkness, checking his watch and the tunnel entrances with the paranoid efficiency of someone who had survived too many close calls. "They're bringing in specialists," he said without preamble, his voice barely above a whisper in the echoing darkness. "Counter-sniper teams from the capital, experienced hunters who know how to track people like us. Plus, they've tripled the reward for information leading to your capture. Dead or alive, but preferably alive so they can make an example of you." Amara had expected this escalation, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill down her spine. She had studied enough military history to know what happened to irregular fighters who became too effective, too much of a symbol of resistance. They were hunted with resources that regular soldiers never faced, pursued by specialists whose only job was to eliminate threats that conventional forces couldn't handle. "How long do you think we have?" she asked, checking her rifle for the 100th time that day. The weapon had become more than a tool. It was her lifeline, the difference between survival and capture in a war where capture meant torture, public execution, and the destruction of everyone who had ever helped her. "Not long," Dragan replied honestly. "Maybe a week, maybe less. They've got tracking dogs now, thermal imaging equipment, and enough manpower to search every building in the city if they have to. Plus, they're getting smart about using civilians as bait, setting up operations designed to draw you out into the open." The thought of innocent people being used as lures for her capture made Amara's jaw clench with suppressed fury. It was a tactic she had feared they would eventually resort to, manufacturing atrocities specifically designed to trigger her intervention, knowing that her conscience wouldn't allow her to stand by while civilians suffered. It was psychological warfare at its most cynical, turning her greatest strength into a potentially fatal weakness. But even as the noose tightened around her, Amara discovered that her actions had inspired something she hadn't expected: imitators. Reports began filtering in from other parts of the besieged city about mysterious sniper attacks that didn't match her usual methods or locations. Other resistance fighters, inspired by her success, were attempting to replicate her tactics with varying degrees of effectiveness. Some of these copycat operations were successful, adding to the psychological pressure on enemy forces who now had to worry about multiple invisible threats rather than just one. Others were disasters that resulted in the deaths of well-meaning but undertrained civilians who lacked the skills or preparation necessary for such dangerous work. Each failure was a reminder of how thin the line was between heroism and suicide in the deadly game she had been playing for months. The enemy's response to these multiple threats was predictably brutal. Collective punishments became more common, with entire neighborhoods subjected to artillery bombardment or house-to-house searches whenever a sniper attack occurred in their vicinity. The message was clear: if the population wouldn't give up the snipers, everyone would pay the price for their silence. This escalation forced Amara to make increasingly difficult decisions about when and where to operate. Every shot she fired now had to be weighed against the potential cost in civilian casualties from the inevitable retaliation. The mathematics of warfare had become a moral equation with no clear solutions, forcing her to calculate not just wind speed and bullet drop, but human suffering and the greater good. It was during this period of mounting pressure that Amara received intelligence about an operation that would test every skill she had developed and every principle she held dear. Enemy forces were planning to evacuate their senior command staff from the city, having finally acknowledged that their position was becoming untenable. The evacuation would take place by helicopter from the roof of the occupied government building, and among those leaving would be the colonel responsible for ordering the execution of civilians in the main square. Colonel Markovich had become a symbol of everything Amara despised about the forces laying siege to her city. A career officer who had embraced ethnic cleansing as military strategy, he had personally overseen dozens of operations designed to terrorize the civilian population into submission. Intelligence reports suggested that his departure would be followed by an escalation in artillery bombardments designed to level the city rather than capture intact. The tactical challenges of targeting the evacuation were enormous. The government building was heavily fortified and surrounded by multiple layers of security. The helicopter landing would take place on a rooftop over 600 meters from the nearest conceivable shooting position, requiring a shot that would test the limits of her equipment and abilities. Most daunting of all, she would have only a few seconds to make the shot before the helicopter lifted off and carried its passengers to safety. But as Amara studied the intelligence reports and aerial photographs that had been smuggled to her at considerable risk, she began to see possibilities that others might miss. The enemy's confidence in their security arrangements was also their weakness. They expected threats to come from obvious directions, from buildings with clear sight lines to their position, from known sniper nests that had been used in previous operations. They weren't prepared for an attack from a direction that seemed impossible. The water tower on the far side of the industrial district had been damaged early in the siege, its steel framework twisted by artillery fire until it resembled a geometric sculpture more than functional infrastructure. But Amara's careful measurements revealed that despite its apparent instability, the structure was still sound enough to support a sniper's weight. More importantly, its position would allow her to shoot from an angle that the enemy's counter-sniper specialists would never anticipate. Getting to the water tower required a journey across the most dangerous part of the city, through sectors where enemy patrols moved constantly, and where the slightest mistake would result in immediate death or capture. Amara spent 2 days planning the route, memorizing every alleyway and bombed-out building that could provide cover, timing the patrol schedules with stopwatch precision. The night before the evacuation, she made her way through the urban wasteland like a ghost returning to haunt the living. Every shadow could conceal an enemy soldier. Every sound might signal discovery and death. But months of living on the edge of survival had honed her senses to supernatural sharpness. She moved through the ruins with the confidence of someone who had learned to read danger in the angle of broken glass and the way rubble shifted underfoot. Reaching the water tower required a climb that would have challenged an experienced mountaineer under ideal conditions. The twisted steel framework offered handholds, but many were sharp enough to cut through gloves, and the entire structure groaned ominously with every movement. Amara ascended slowly, testing each grip point carefully, knowing that a single slip would send her plummeting to the concrete below. Her shooting position was a narrow platform about 60 meters above ground level, providing an unobstructed view of the government building's rooftop while remaining invisible to observers at ground level. The wind was stronger at this height, requiring calculations that pushed her mathematical skills to their limits. Temperature differentials between the elevated position and ground level would affect bullet trajectory in ways that were difficult to predict with precision. As dawn approached, Amara settled into position and began her final preparations. The shot she was attempting was at the very edge of what was possible with her equipment, over 600 meters through swirling wind to a target that would be visible for perhaps 10 seconds. Miss, and she would never get another chance. Worse, the muzzle flash from such an exposed position would immediately reveal her location to every enemy force in the area. Through her scope, she could see activity beginning on the government building's rooftop as security teams prepared the landing zone. Soldiers moved with the efficient urgency of professionals who knew their window of vulnerability was limited. Anti-aircraft weapons were positioned to discourage any attempt at intercepting the helicopter, while snipers took overwatch positions that would theoretically prevent exactly what Amara was attempting to accomplish. The helicopter appeared as a speck on the horizon at exactly 7:15 a.m., growing rapidly larger as it approached the landing zone. Amara tracked its approach through her scope, calculating wind drift and making minute adjustments to her aim point. Everything had to be perfect: the angle, the timing, the compensation for multiple variables that could mean the difference between success and failure. Colonel Markovich emerged onto the rooftop as the helicopter settled into its landing approach, flanked by bodyguards and moving with the confident stride of someone who believed himself beyond the reach of his enemies. He paused for a moment at the edge of the landing zone, turning to look out over the city he had spent months trying to destroy, and in that instant of arrogant satisfaction, he sealed his own fate. The shot was fired at exactly 7:18 a.m., the bullet traveling over 600 meters in just over half a second before finding its target with surgical precision. Colonel Markovich dropped instantly, his bodyguards immediately confused about what had happened and where the threat might be coming from. The helicopter pilot, trained to react to any sign of danger, immediately aborted the landing and pulled away from the rooftop, leaving the remaining evacuation candidates stranded and exposed. But Amara didn't wait to observe the chaos she had created. The moment she fired, she began her descent from the water tower, knowing that every second of delay brought enemy forces closer to her position. Counter-battery radar would have detected her muzzle flash within moments, and reaction forces were probably already racing toward her location with orders to capture or kill the sniper who had just eliminated one of their senior commanders. The climb down was even more treacherous than the ascent, complicated by the need for speed and the psychological pressure of knowing that discovery meant certain death. Steel cables cut into her hands despite her gloves, and more than once she nearly lost her grip on framework slicked by morning dew. But desperation lent her strength and agility that she never knew she possessed. She reached ground level just as the first enemy vehicles arrived at the base of the water tower, their occupants deploying with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had done this before. But Amara was already gone, vanishing into the maze of bombed-out buildings that had become her domain over long months of survival and warfare. The manhunt that followed was unlike anything the city had seen during the entire siege. Helicopters circled overhead like metallic vultures, their thermal imaging cameras scanning every possible hiding place. Ground forces moved through the ruins in coordinated sweeps, accompanied by tracking dogs and portable detection equipment. The reward for her capture increased hourly as enemy commanders realized that allowing her to escape would be seen as a devastating failure by their superiors. For 3 days and nights, Amara played a deadly game of hide and seek through the ruins of her beloved city. She moved only during artillery bombardments, using the chaos and noise to mask her movements from listening devices. She sheltered in locations no sane person would choose: collapsed basements filled with rubble, sewage tunnels that had been damaged by bombing, the burned-out hulks of vehicles that provided concealment, but no protection from the elements. Food became a distant memory, water a precious resource measured in drops rather than glasses. Sleep came in brief, restless intervals between the constant need to keep moving, to stay ahead of the hunters who pursued her with professional determination and unlimited resources. Her rifle, once a trusted companion, became a burden that slowed her movements while remaining essential for survival. On the fourth night, as exhaustion began to cloud her judgment and slow her reflexes, salvation came from an unexpected source. The young soldier she had spared in the main square appeared like an apparition in the bombed-out church where she had taken shelter. For a terrifying moment, Amara thought her luck had finally run out, that the boy had led enemy forces to her hiding place in exchange for the reward money. But instead of pointing a weapon at her, the young soldier held up his hands in a gesture of peace, speaking in whispered words that would change everything. "My sister was one of the hostages you saved. I know a way out of the city, but we have to go now, before the morning patrol begins." The escape route he offered led through abandoned sewer tunnels that had been damaged by bombing, but remained partially navigable. It was dangerous, requiring hours of crawling through contaminated water and unstable passages, but It represented the only chance of getting beyond the enemy's search perimeter before they sealed off every possible exit from the city. As Amara followed her unlikely guide through the underground labyrinth that would carry her to safety, she reflected on the strange turns that had brought a literature professor to this moment. The woman who had emerged from those tunnels would be different from the one who had entered them, marked forever by the knowledge of what one person could accomplish when pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Years later, when historians attempted to document the siege and its heroes, they would struggle to separate fact from legend in the story of the ghost of Sarajevo. But the survivors knew the truth, that in the darkest hours of their city's suffering, when hope seemed as distant as peace, one woman had stood between innocence and atrocity with nothing but courage, precision, and the unwavering belief that some fights are worth any price. The war would end, borders would be redrawn, and politicians would claim credit for victories they never earned. But the memory of 12 shots fired in 8 minutes, and the impossible woman who fired them, would live on as proof that heroism comes in forms that no military academy teaches and no strategist can predict. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon against tyranny is simply someone who refuses to accept that the innocent must suffer while the guilty prosper. Amara Kovac became a ghost in more ways than one, disappearing into a new life where her past remained buried as deeply as the secrets that kept her alive. But in the hearts of those she saved, and in the nightmares of those who hunted her, the ghost of Sarajevo remained forever real, a reminder that justice, like a sniper's bullet, can come from the most unexpected directions and strike with lethal precision when least expected.